So I'll start at the beginning. My name is Garrett Lesko. I'm the fly tying chair for the Lynn Benton Family Fly Fishers. Last month we kind of did our trial and probing kind of session, and it seemed like most of the club was pretty novice to fly tying, and they wanted to learn the basics. And so we're going to spend probably the next 6 months from now until the end of the year. That's kind of my plan, to do some basic flies. We're going to start off with a woolly bugger, and then next month I just sent it off to Steve Shoepeltz, our vice president, who does our newsletter. It's going to be a hare's ear next month, just to give those who are here and those who are watching live a sneak peek to what we're going to do. So first thing I'm going to do is go over the materials for this fly. Colors are completely up to you. You don't have to tie it in black or an olive or a green or a blue or an orange. It's all up to you. After this, anyone who's interested, I meant to print them off just to have them. I forgot today at work. But please email me. I'll have variation sheets after all this, because we'll tie a basic pattern, but there's lots of variations to all these fly patterns. A lot of these fly patterns are what I would consider a chassis fly pattern. You start off with the main fly, and then you can just keep adding or subtracting or changing onto it to make new and different patterns. So with a black woolly bugger, you can go any which way, upside, downside, any way you want. So I'll kind of go over a little bit of that. But we'll go over some of the tools, we'll go over the materials, and then we'll get into tying. Tools, everyone should have a fly tying vise. If you don't have a fly tying vise, you're going to want one for tying flies. I use a Regal Revolution, I believe is the name. Revolution. It's the nicer Regal. You don't have to get as fancy. Marv over here has a mongoose, I believe. That's the Renzetti mongoose. Yeah. Excellent. Starter vise. Peaks are great. Dyna King. I'm trying to think of any other ones. Nor vices. Dan vices. There's lots of different vices, but you need a fly tying vise. The next tool you're going to need for a fly like this is you're going to need a bobbin with thread. I use 10-aught Vise for almost all my trout flies. 10-aught or 12-aught Vise. Sizing is like hooks. The bigger the number, the smaller the thread. So 6-aught is going to be your largest, where 18-aught would be your smallest. There's a different sizing that certain brands use. For example, if you use Danville thread, they use denier. 70 is smaller than 140. 140 is smaller than 210. It goes in 70 denier increments. 70 denier is equivalent to 6-aught thread. So I like Vise a lot because you can get thin thread, but it's equally as strong. So this 10-aught is probably as strong as 6-aught. 12-aught is probably as strong as 8-aught, and so on and so forth. So Vise is really strong thread. It's really high quality. That's why I like Dr. Slick. Renzetti make a nice pair. Loon makes a nice pair. I prefer tungsten scissors. They hold their edge really well. But again, it's just personal preferences. And then I use a whip finish tool. I'm one of those guys who uses a whip finish tool instead of my hands or a half hitch tool. It's just a personal preference. So that's all you need for a woolly bugger. In the vise right now, I have a size 6 3x long hook. I'm using a size 6 because I want it to be seen. I want you guys to be able to see it as well as I can. You can tie these flies down. I believe on the newsletter I said as small as a size 12. Some guys tie 14s, but at that point the issue is the hackle. You usually can't get hackle that small. So tie size 6, and then you're going to want to match. I'm going to tie it without a bead, but there's lots and lots and lots of beads you can use in any color. It doesn't matter. I'll put these up here so everyone can see the different colors. There's tons and tons and tons of colors you can go with. You can do a gold bead, a black bead, a silver bead, a copper bead on a black woolly bugger. You can do pink beads, orange beads, chartreuse beads. A very common fly, especially in competitive fly fishing, is a black woolly bugger, a black bugger style fly with a chartreuse bead. They call it a blank saver. I don't know why they call it that, but that's what they do. The next material you're going to do, we'll work our way from tail to top of the fly, is Marabou. Any brand will do of the Marabou that you like. I prefer a blood quill Marabou or a woolly bugger style Marabou. Marabou's harvested from Turkey, domesticated Turkey. And so blood quills are going to have all very straight tips to your Marabou, where woolly bugger is more fluffy, more plumage. People tend to use woolly bugger Marabou for woolly buggers, but you can use either or. It's just up to you. Blood quills tend to do better for larger size flies, where woolly bugger Marabou tends to do better for smaller flies. But again, it's all preference. You can use whatever you'd like. The next is going to be a body material. I have this complete tangle of chenille here that's full of other random scraps of materials. But this is a smaller, this is small chenille, and then I have a card of medium chenille. For this size, I'll use a medium chenille. If you get smaller flies, you're going to want to use a thinner diameter chenille. You can see the diameter there on the screen, comparatively to this stuff. So it all just depends on what size fly you're going to tie and what kind of look you're going to want. I got this from somebody who gave me just a big wad of it, and it's knotted itself over the years, but they got it from a skein. Some companies allow you to buy skeins of chenille instead of cards. Excuse me. The next material we'll use is a hackle. This is actually marketed as woolly bugger hackle. But some kind of wet fly saddle hackle or a soft hackle, if you want something that's softer. And we'll get into, when we tie the hackle in, I'll show you the difference between soft hackle fibers and not soft. No one calls them hard hackle fibers, but soft fibers or webby fibers versus dry fly or stiffer fibers. And then optional materials is some kind of flash. So in this case, I'm using just some generic flash. This is from Fly Tier's Dungeon, but you can use Krystal flash, flashabout, whatever accent flash, whatever flash you like. Each flash has its own properties. Flashabout, for example, is softer and buoyant, where Krystal flash is stiffer and not as buoyant as it. If you use stuff like accent flash, it's just like Krystal flash, but it's thinner. You can use saltwater flash, which is thicker flashabout. You can use anything you'd like, whatever floats your boat. But a Krystal flash, some kind of either crimped or a twisted flash, tends to do well for streamers like this. The other way to do it, when I first started tying flies, I wanted something very cost-effective for flash. So you can use flash chenille. So this chenille has tinsel blended into it, and it comes in tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of colors. And some of them really cool colors that you can't get anywhere else. So when I was first starting to tie flies, one of the first colors I tied woolly buggers with was this black and gold color. So the gold's already mixed in. I don't need to add it into the tail. It's no extra step. It's just using a different material. So if you're trying to be a little bit more thrifty, that's the way to do it. It also gets you some cool designs. So you can tie an all black fly, but then use this cherry pearl color. So then you get this more claret blood leech looking fly because you used a very fluffy hackle. You can use something to be synthetic peacock. So instead of using peacock pearl, you can use a peacock style chenille. But yeah, so we're going to tie this fly. I'm going to do it sans bead because I think it's a little bit more challenging to do it without a bead. And if you can do it without a bead, you can do it definitely with a bead. So we'll start the fly off. You're going to wrap your thread around the hook once or twice and then back over itself. In fly tying, we call this a jam knot. It's not really addressed that often in fly tying because it's such a integral part of tying a fly. It's not really a... it becomes second. I don't even think about it anymore at this point. I just tie my thread on my hook. Eventually, it's just going to become muscle memory. You're going to see me a lot of the time counter spinning my bobbin, where I'll spin my bobbin counterclockwise. The reason why is every wrap you do around the hook shank, if you're right-handed, I think everyone here is tying right-handed from what I can tell. Every time you do one wrap around the hook, you're adding one clockwise twist into your thread. So eventually, over time, your thread's going to go from flat to corded. I prefer tying with flat thread. Flat thread's going to be Danville, UTC, Semperfli are all flat threads. Vise threads are all flat besides their 16-aught thread and their 6-aught thread. Those are both corded for some reason. Flat threads are really nice because you get a very smooth body, and that's what I'm going to be talking about a lot in the fly tying. From this fly to the last fly I tie with the club is smooth body. We're building this fly like a house. You want to build each layer soundly as we go up. We don't want rocky issues. We don't want issues with materials. We don't want lumps or bumps because that's just going to get magnified as we keep adding materials onto the fly. I have a lot of friends who are traditional Atlantic salmon fly tiers, and they are very, 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 very specific with where they put their materials. So on this fly right now, I'm going to stop right where the barb stops on the hook shank. That's just where I will rest my my thread here. As you can see, my thread is already auto counter spinning itself out, If I don't want to wait for that, I can do my own spin. But I want that thread hanging there and relaxing while I find the feather that I'm looking for. So the feather I'm looking for is going to be a fluffy feather with as little damage as possible to the barbules. So to break down what a feather is you're going to have the stem of a feather, which is the central point of the feather, and then you're going to have either the barbules or hurls or whatever you want to call it to the side that extend off the feather that give it plume. I'm pulling from a blood quill, and the reason why, I don't know why they call it blood quill, but the distinct feature is when you pull them all to the end, you'll see that the tips all line up. Everyone can see it here, everyone can see it on the screen. The tips all line up like a paintbrush almost. And that's really nice if we're tying a fly and we want all the tips to be even, because natural fibers are going to have a natural taper to them, unlike a synthetic. So that's going to give you a really good presentation here, where your fly is going to be fluffier towards the butt and thinner at the tip. The size of fly this is, I'm going to tie it in and just use the entire feather. If I have a spare feather here, if I was tying a smaller fly, if I was tying a fly like a size 10, which is significantly smaller than a 6, I'm not going to use the whole feather. What I'll do is I will go to the stem, peel off the bottom 1/4 inch of hurls or barbules, so it's prepped like this, and then I'm going to pull off how many I'm going to need, and then tear those away from the shank. This way I can use not the entire feather. I can still tie 2 or 3 more flies with this feather, and I can still use it. So we're being efficient with our materials. You can't do that with a giant fly. Bob is over there tying a thin mint, which is a variation of a woolly bugger, and he's tying in 3 separate colors of Marabou. Personally, for me, I would tie a third. If I was tying a size 6 like this, I would take a third, all of a third brown, a third black. That way my tail isn't so fluffy, it's not letting water get absorbed. So the way a woolly bugger is traditionally tied is the tail is going to be the same length as the shank of the hook. So you're going to use, the way I described it last month with Steve is you have a material hand and you have a thread hand. And so that way we don't get confused with lefts and right. Your right hand your thread hand is going to be on the hook eye side of the hook. So with your thread hand, you're going to measure out the length of the tail you want. This would be too long of a tail. As you can see, it's very, very long there. And I'm okay with it being a little bit long. It's not a huge deal. It's just up to your preference. You don't want a super short tail because you want some motion, but if you have it too long, then the fish are just going to eat the tail and not the fly. So I would say that's a hook length and 1/4 probably. And then I'm going to have it pinched with my thread fingers, and I'm going to transfer that measurement to my material hand. So you have your thread hand, material hand. It's just a pinch transfer. That's all I'm doing. That's the transfer. Then I'm going to put the material on top of the hook. I'm going to bring my thread up. I'm going to pinch the thread. As you can see, I don't have any tension on the thread being pinched by my fingers. I'm going to bring it down, and then I'm going to pull the thread through my fingers, attach it there. Stabilize with that finger still, and one more wrap over the top. Because every thread wrap, you're going to want to lock that thread wrap at least once. So now that that's on there, I can let go and give it tension because I've done 1 tie-in wrap and 1 locking wrap. You shouldn't need more than 3 wraps to hold any material in place. The next wrap will go over the top to lock everything in. But if you notice here, the tail can pivot. I don't want the tail to pivot to the underside of my hook, so you're going to want to lift the butts up and do 1 wrap over, 1 wrap on top. And what that does is it limits the spin when you do stuff like that, or if you throw a wrap under the tail. Hopefully everyone can see that. Throw a wrap under the tail. And what that does is it almost jams the material on the hook, and then the spin possibilities is much less. And that's what we want. We don't want that tail to spin to the underside of the hook bend. It's going to foul. It's not going to look right. The next thing you want to do is you can see all this extra material. You can see this material down here of fluff. You can save these feathers and use these for your smaller flies. You can tie some size 6s and some size 10s with the same feather if you wanted to. But we're not going to cut this here. We're going to want to cut it right where we started that thread, 2 eye lengths back. The reason why is we want that body to be smooth. We don't want just a lump at the tail. because that lump at the tail is going to get magnified as we add in Hackle and as we add in chenille. So then, with my fingers, I'm going to work my way up the body in open spirals to trap down that material. You can see it's not very neat yet, but then we're going to work our way back down. Again, we're tying in all that material, and now the body is tied in. That tail's not going to pull out. It's going to tear, but it's not going to pull out. If you tie with any black material, you're going to see your fingertips are going to get all stained. It's the dye. The dye they use, they don't set super well. Yeah, so olive isn't this bad, and most other colors aren't so bad. Maybe red might leak a little bit. But that's going to be your tail of your fly. The next thing we're going to want to tie in, because we're going to have two things go up the body, it's going to be the Hackle and the chenille. We're going to want to tie in first to last. So if it's the last material working up the body of the fly, you want to tie that in first. It goes in stages. There's two options you can do with this. You can get a, we can use a wire, or we can use without a wire. We're going to do it without a wire because it tends to be the simpler reason. Every bag of material you're going to get, especially natural materials, it's a grab bag. You have no idea the quality. You never know the quality. So what you're going to want to do is look for a feather that meets the qualities you're after, and we'll go over it. I'll show it to everybody. So this feather right here is what I consider a soft feather, a webby feather. As you can see, when I pull the feather tip, you can see that the barbules coming off the stem do not separate. They stay together, almost like they're Velcro together. That's a term in feathers that we call webby. They're webby. They want to stick like a spider web. Where if you take a feather like this, which is not, you can notice that when I pull the stem and bend the stem, all those little barbules stick out from the stem. What you get from that is more structure but less movement. So it's up to you on what you want your fly to be. Do you want it to have more movement, or do you want it to have more shoulders or volume or shape? Because as you strip this fly through the water, it's not going to look like, if I got this fly all wet, that's not what it's going to look like. It's going to look like what it is dry. And every time you strip it, it's like blowing on it. It's going to push everything down. And do you want it to spring up, or do you want it to keep wiggling along the side? I personally like a more movement in my fly, generally speaking. So I'm looking for a feather that has a blend of both, and that I can showcase you guys so you guys can see that. It's actually a quality feather. Okay, so this is a pretty decent feather. I like this feather. As a fly tyer, I was talking to some guys at the shop on Saturday. You'll become very particular because now you're making your own thing. So even though you may have a fly that you like, if you started to tie it, you're going to find very particular things that you like about it. Shades, colors, brands, shapes, tints, proportions, whatever it may be. You may like this woolly bugger and go, you know what, the way Garrett ties it is great, I like it, but the tail is way too short. I want that tail super long because I want lots of motion. Or you're going to say, hey, I love hackles like that, but I want that hackle so tight to the body you can barely see it, but just adds a little bit of that bugginess. You'll find certain preferences and find certain things that you like specifically. When it comes to prepping these feathers, you don't need all this fluff down here. This is also marabou. We wouldn't classify it as marabou. Most people will refer to it as fluff on a feather. I don't want a lot of that. I want very little. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my fingers, I'm going to stroke it back to pull everything perpendicular. I'm going to support the stem, and I'm going to strip it off like I'm unpeeling a banana. That's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to unpeel. It should just peel right off the stem like that. And I don't need to get it super clean. I just want to handle. And you can see I left a little bit of fluff there, because if I get to the end of the fly and I want some of that fluff on there, again, it's going to add a little bit more motion. The reason why we strip it off is we're trying to strip it off, as if you can see here, I don't know how well you guys can see on the screen, but if you look on the feather, you'll notice it goes from thin to thick really fast. It's really dramatic. Can everyone see that? The transition where it goes from thin, 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 thick. The taper on there is really fast. That thick feather is more brittle, and it's also harder to tie in. So if you're looking on the screen, you'll see that taper goes from thin, 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 thick. Right there is where it's kind of tapering. We want to use that as our grip. Adds more dexterity to your tying, but we don't want to tie that part off. It might be easier to show here on the white side. So you'll see thin, 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 thicks right up, right right about there is when you can see the taper start to be really dramatic. Again, we don't want that. We want to be able to tie in on a thin location. It makes it easier to tie in and better. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab the feather by the tip. We're going to hold it by the tip, and that's going to be our tie-in, and we're going to stroke all the fibers back. As you can see, they're all sticking out perpendicular to the stem. Everyone can see that there? We're going to see it on the screen. Perpendicular to the stem. And then we're going to tie in this feather on the near side of the hook. The tip that did not stand out, that's going to be our tie-in point. And we're just going to do 1-2 wraps and then open spirals the whole way up. The next thing we're going to tie in is our body material. You can use chenille. I like chenille a lot. It's really convenient because you can just either leave it on the card or the hank and go from there. But dubbing is also a great material. So if you don't like chenille and you want to use dubbing, there's a fly I tie. It's going to be on the variation page that I send out to anyone who wants it. And that's going to have, I use ice dubbing for the body. It's easy to pick out. It gets really buggy. Bob's tying that thin mint over there. The traditional pattern uses peacock herl as a chenille. You can use peacock ice dub. There's no rules on that. I strip off a little bit of the chenille core, so it exposes just the threads, because I'm going to use that as my tie-in point. If you notice, I'm tying everything in around the same spot, but allowing a taper. So I'm going to go back. Once I get about here where the hackle fibers can be caught, I stroke everything back, and then I make sure I end at the same tie-in point. It's harder to see because it's all black here, but this is probably your best color of woolly bugger, and so that's why I brought it. So once you have it tied in, you're going to wrap it the same direction you wrap your thread. So pull everything back so you don't trap it with this wrap of chenille, and then you're going to go over and over. Again, touching wraps. They don't need to be directly touching, but touching the next section. As you can see, the body is going to get nice and fluffy here. And then it's going to taper down where that cut-in point is. I stroke everything back so I can get a nice wrap in. Then I'm going to go catch it, over, pull through, catch it, over, pull through, and then one in front. So 2 over the top of the material we're tying off, and then 1 underneath to lock everything in. Then I'm going to pull it away from my thread and cut it off. It's a really simple body. It should look like a little worm at this point. There's an original fly called the woolly worm. It's the predecessor to the woolly bugger. And the woolly worm uses, it doesn't have a marabou tail, it has a yarn tail. So that's the only difference, but same concept. So we're trying to make a woolly worm. The bugger, it's a bugger when you add a tail to it, a marabou tail. So then we're going to do the exact same thing with our hackle here. We're going to pull everything, I pull everything back just so everything's pointing towards the tail. That's the kind of the motion we're after. And then instead of doing touching wraps, we're going to do open spiral. Watch that hook point because it can cut your tail. But as we keep wrapping back, we're going to keep doing open spirals, open spirals, open spirals, open spirals. And as we get towards the front, we're going to keep stroking everything back. Make sure nothing gets caught. Make sure nothing is twisted. You can see all the fibers kind of wanting to point backwards or straight up and down. That's what we want. We don't want things going forward. Then we're going to wrap touching wraps to end it. We're going to try to use up this whole feather. Keeps going. Keep going. As you remember the stem that we had, nice and thin, we're up all the way up to the hook eye, and then we're going to tie it off. 1 wrap over the top, 2 wraps over the top, pull everything back so nothing's going forward, as everyone can see there, right? The eye and the eye is exposed and the material is exposed. And we're going to build up a small thread head, folding everything back. And then before we tie off this fly, I counterspin it, because if you're trying to tie a knot with corded thread, it's going to want to bind on itself. It's going to want to furl. I don't want it to furl. So then I do a whip finish. 1, 2, 3. 3 turns like always. You can do a second whip finish if you don't have glue. I don't have any glue on me. So we're going to do a second whip finish to just double over the top. And then I sharpen my whip finish tool, but you can just use your scissors to cut. And then we have the stem here, and we can just break it off. I would not recommend that to any new tiers, just because I don't know how tight you've tied your fly, but we do want to, but otherwise just use your scissors. But as you can see here, this is a fully dressed, very simple woolly bugger.